Okay, guys, so welcome to our session on Plato's Republic, right? This is where things begin to get interesting because this is where we really start to delve into uh, philosophy, okay? So let me begin by explaining what I mean here by philosophy, okay? Now, you might have noticed that the text that we are reading is not called an introduction to philosophy, and it doesn't even have what we would deem to be a philosophical title. It is called Republic, right? The state. It's talking about the state. And so the subject matter is obviously politics, right? So then, how does this relate in any way to what we have been discussing earlier? And why is it that we can we began by noting that now we are going to delve into philosophy. So let's take a step back. Okay. The usually when we want to think about a particular topic, right, we think through language, we think through words that we know, right, certain categories. So for example, the category good and bad, the category evil, ugly, beautiful, ugly, or for example, virtual versus real, right? We think through these categories. Similarly, and at university, right, one of the things that the university academia does is that it takes knowledge and it puts it into different categories, right, different filing cabinets, so to speak. So you have a filing cabinet that is called philosophy, a filing cabinet that is called politics, economy, and so forth. And so it appears as though they are divorced from one another, right? So if you want to study philosophy, you go to the philosophy department. If you want to study politics, you go to the politics department. They are viewed as two inconsumable, or at the very least, two somewhat exclusive elements, right? Now, why would this text then be considered a philosophical text? Well, for the very simple fact that, and we will explore this in detail, that the philosophical question of where from and where to, the question of origins, is inextricably linked to the question of politics, right? So, in the same way, our answers to the question where from and where to determine our behavior, the ways that a society answers these questions shapes the politics, the political behavior, and the collective future and project or vision of that society. So any political system, any set of political norms, okay, even in a sectarian system, is essentially based on a set of philosophical assumptions. Now, for Plato, philosophy is not something that is merely abstract. Philosophy is something that ought to be embodied. Why? Why should we embody philosophy? Right? Well, because philosophy is not about speculation, right? For the Greeks, philosophy is about discovering the truth. And if you discover the truth and you ascertain the truth, then you ought to live according to what is true, right? In the same way, for example, if you discover that it is true that, let's say, cholesterol will hurt your health, then you would live by that principle, right? You would abstain from certain foods. Well, what if you were to discover a more cosmic truth, right, about the nature of about human nature, for example? Well, you would also want a political system that abides by that assumption and the truth. So philosophy for Plato is a way in which we can reach and know the truth, and then politics is should be for Plato and Aristotle and many others as history progresses. Politics, one of the ways in which we live the truth. So you can think of it this way. right? And this is something that Plato will discuss in the book, that in the same way that the individual embodies a certain set of ideals, um, the the collection of individuals, right, a group of individuals that make up a city state, can also be seen as, if you want to say, like a single body, right, that should also embody um, ideals. So in approaching Plato's Republic, we have to kind of suspend the categorical differentiation between what we have called philosophy versus politics, right? They are one of the same thing. Um, so that's that's the first thing to keep in mind. Now, the second is that Plato is not so much interested in this particular text with uh, philosophical debate, so to speak. Okay, he does that in other books, and we're going to discuss his philosophy, inshallah. What he's interested here is the practical questions, right? The practical questions, meaning that, okay, now that I have established that this is the philosophy I ought to live by, now I must ask the concrete question of how do I put that into practice, right? So again, here we find a philosophy in action, a philosophy that is embodied in the same way our behavior can embody certain facts. Now, is it possible to have a state that is not based on a particular philosophy? Let's try to think about that. One second. Uh, so let's suppose, okay, we try to come up with again, this is just to situate the importance of the discussion, the existential questions in relation to the political question. So let's suppose, for example, we were to gather together and try to think of uh, what would be the ideal city state for, let's say, a place like Beirut. Okay. Now, what is it that we are trying to organize, right? At at the concrete level, we are not concerned. Plato is obviously not concerned with how do we arrange ideas together, right, and then write them down. He is talking about how do we organize the relationships between the individuals in the city. So the subject matter is the human, the person, the individual, and the collective. So naturally, you would have to say something or assume something about human nature. Are humans inherently good, or are they inherently disposed towards greed and injustice? Do humans act according to the principles of justice, or do they act according to the principles of fear? If if humans act out of fear, right, then should we have more laws to constrain the evils of man, or should we have less laws if man is inherently good to allow man to flourish on his own? So if human nature is good, then we need less laws, right? We should allow the individual to flourish and to evolve. If humans are inherently disposed to evil or to greed, then obviously we need laws that constrict their behavior, right? And we would need maybe a strong state and so forth. Now, the question, these set of questions are very much valid for our contemporary political situation. And I introduce this, I talk about the contemporary political situation so that you can understand what exactly it is that Plato is trying to argue for. Okay. Uh, think of it this way. We've met, there is a committee, and we are trying to think of a new a new government, a new form of government for Beirut. Okay, there's been a revolution, whatever it is, and we have to formulate a new uh, government. And so Plato comes along, we're all gathered. Plato comes along and says, I have a proposal. I have a proposed mode of governance, and this mode of governance I call the Republic of the Philosopher King. And I, Plato, I'm going to argue that this is the only valid form of governance. And I'm going to argue that's the only valid form of governance through a discussion with you. We are going to go back and forth, right? So there's a dialogue. And this is what makes Plato so powerful, right? That he engages in a Socratic dialogue. So the text, for example, begins with two individuals, Adiamentus and Glaucon, who are two Athenian citizens that are very much like two average Beirut citizens, right? And Glaucon and Adiamentus are asking Socrates, who in this case is Plato, why are you arguing for a republic? Give us your argument. So what Plato gives us insight into is the debate that's happening, which is very similar to the debate that we would have with Plato if he was with us today, right? So he's giving the arguments for and against. Now, let's go back to our present, okay? So Plato comes in and he says, listen, I propose that we have a republic, and the republic should be a republic that is ruled by the philosopher king. We would ask him why. He would say, because we need a state that operates under the principle of justice. Now, no one would disagree that a state should be based on justice. But then what's the question? What would be the question that is first asked? There might be a group of us who say, well, Plato, that sounds nice in the abstract. That sounds nice in the abstract, but first and foremost, what is justice? We can have multiple definitions of justice. So I could argue, for example, let's say I am a member of this committee. I could say, well, justice means that we distribute wealth according to a person's merit, meaning the amount of talent and creativity and qualifications that person has. Another might say, no, justice is that we distribute things equally. So the first problem with Plato's proposal is that so Plato, the first problem that we have with justice is, well, isn't justice subjective? There's different notions of justice. And then the second is a more fundamental question, which is, wait a minute, does justice even exist? One second, guys. With my COVID problems. One second. I don't know. Check in your room under your clothes and stuff. So there's two questions, right? When Plato first puts the proposal, and this is what the book starts off with, right? This is the first chapter here, and where it says in introduction, book 2, Adiamentus and Glaucon restate the question, i.e. the question of justice. So someone might say, well, there are competing definitions of justice, so which one do we adopt? Okay, March 14, March 8, for example. And secondly, does justice even exist? Now that might seem like an odd question. Does justice even exist? But if you think about it, if I were to ask you, point to justice for me, point it out, right, with your finger, you would not be able to point to a material object and say, this is justice. For example, here, this is an iPhone, right? And I would not be able to, for example, point to my head and say, oh, well, justice is somewhere in here. It's an idea. Well, then you would tell me, okay, I don't have access to your cognitive or your consciousness. what is justice? If justice is something that ought to reign supreme, you should be able to articulate it in objective terms. It ought to be something that I can discover. Okay, so this is the first thing that Plato wants to try to prove, that one, justice exists objectively, and two, that there is one form of justice which can be discovered, and that justice should not be reduced to personal opinion, right? If I were to say, for example, well, my opinion is that the sky is red, that doesn't mean the sky is red. That is just my opinion. It doesn't negate the objective fact that the sky is not red. So similarly, Plato wants to argue that, look, it doesn't matter if Glaucon and Adiamantus have their own opinions on what is justice. No, there is an objective definition of justice. So then the question is, well, who figures it out? Who discovers it? Right? Here is Plato's brilliant answer. It is not the politician who is interested in power. It is not the merchant who is interested in economic costs and benefit, right? Because these two individuals might interpret justice according to their own interests and desires. Nor is it defined by the majority, because the majority is always influenced and prone to being influenced by the elite. Who discovers justice? Well, justice is an idea. And who is the best one equipped to deal with ideas objectively? The philosopher. So at this point, okay, from a cursory glance, Plato seems to have a very, very good argument, right? He perhaps has a very solid argument, right? And really, the only way to critique this would be to try to deal with the foundations that that Plato is advocating, the idea of justice being objective and whatnot. And these are philosophical foundations. So here, our political discussion, our debate of this committee becomes somewhat philosophical, okay? And it doesn't matter if, well, the idea doesn't sit good with us, or it's not, I prefer a more free state, right? That's not gonna cut the cake, right? We would need to respond to Plato, which is what really political philosophy since the Greeks has essentially been, a pursuit of trying to debate Plato. We would have to come up with an alternative. We would have to deal with Plato's foundational philosophy, right? So some of the things that you need to think about is, okay, so first and foremost, if I were to critique this model of governance, right? I'll show you guys the book where it's articulated at more length. Where would I start? If you want to critique Plato, where would we start, right? Imagine, again, we're a committee. We're trying to find a good government for Beirut and a good state for Beirut, a new republic, whatever it is. And we have to respond to Plato. This guy is giving good arguments. So would we argue that no, justice is not real? If we do that, where does that leave us? Why even revolt? Why protest? Right? Is justice subjective? Well, if justice is subjective, then that means essentially that we are just replacing one tyrant with another and imposing his interpretation of things, right? If, on the contrast, we say, you know what, I agree, Plato, that justice is an objective value that we can discover, but it is not what you think it is. It comes from somewhere else. Then this is another type of argument. And we would have to explain to Plato, where can we find this objective form of justice? Is it in society? Is it in reason? Is it in the divine intellect of God? Is it in the world of ideals that Plato argues for, and so forth? So immediately we can begin to see why this text is so popular and why this text is so brilliant. So even, for example, myself, right, in preparing for PhDs and stuff like that, I always find myself in my readings forced to come back to the question of Plato. Right? It's not something that I had to deal with as an undergrad, but it is something that continues to uh, uh, influence and shape our politics. And Plato continues to make a comeback. Okay, so let me say finally one more thing about, again, this is all to get you guys thinking about the text. Okay, so let me give you some context. Okay, when this debate was taking place in the Republic, the in Athens, this was not taking place at a time of political crisis. For example, uh, like in Lebanon now, right? This was not happening at a time of where there was a despotic king. This was actually taking place within a democracy. So Plato is providing an alternative to democracy. And this is also striking, and this is also somewhat odd, because we would think, right, that this whole discussion would be taking place, for example, in refutation of a prevailing monarchy or a single party or oligarchical dictatorship, right? But it's not. Plato is actually critiquing democracy, the democracy of his time, right? Athenian democracy, which is considered the model of democracy. And Adiamantis and Glaucon are trying to justify why a democracy is perhaps the best of or the lesser of all evils. Now, what exactly is Plato's critique of democracy? Well, it becomes very clear in the discussion with Glaucon and Adiamantis. But I would leave one idea as food for thought, right? What happens when the majority is swayed and influenced by a politician who has a sweet tongue, who has control of the arts in our day, that would be the media, right? What happens, for example, if a majority were to introduce and support an immoral law? And if the majority supports the immoral law, what makes it immoral? If there is no objective criteria, right? That can say that no, the majority is sometimes right and sometimes wrong. So begin thinking about that and make sure that you have read the introduction, especially book 4, for our coming discussion, inshallah. See you guys tomorrow.